In December 2001, Argentina stopped paying its debts. Not because it wanted to, because it couldn't. It was the largest sovereign default in history. Over $100 billion evaporated overnight. Banks shut their doors. ATMs ran dry. The middle class lost everything in a week. And yet, behind that chaos stood something colder, a mechanism designed to protect the creditors, not the country. That same mechanism, refined, digitized, legalized, now lives inside the balance sheets of U.S. states. At first glance, that sounds absurd. How could the richest country on earth repeat the logic of a Latin American collapse? But look closer. Argentina didn't fall because it was poor. It fell because it borrowed in a currency it didn't control, because its own money was tied by law to the U.S. dollar, a foreign promise it could never print. The convertibility plan, as it was called, looked like stability. 1 peso for $1. A perfect illusion, until it wasn't. Today, several American states, Illinois, New Jersey, even California, are caught in a modern version of the same trap. Their budgets depend on capital markets they don't control. Their debt is issued in a currency they can't create. Their pensions are indexed to markets that assume infinite growth. When the flow of cheap credit stops, the arithmetic becomes identical to Buenos Aires 2001. Revenues fall, obligations remain. Political will collapses under the weight of math. Back then, Argentina's default was portrayed as a uniquely Latin tragedy: corruption, mismanagement, passion over prudence. But the real story was structural. It was about sovereignty and liquidity, about who controls the switch that turns money on and off. 2 decades later, the same switch sits in Washington, and every state that relies on it, every municipal bond, every pension promise, is wired to that same circuit. The mechanism didn't die in 2001. It migrated. To understand how Argentina reached that December night in 2001, we have to return to the 1990s, a decade that promised modernity, order, and the end of chaos. After years of hyperinflation that erased savings daily, President Carlos Menem introduced a radical cure, the convertibility plan. 1 peso would equal $1 US. Always. By law. It was elegant on paper. The central bank could only issue pesos if it had an equivalent amount of dollars in reserve. Inflation vanished almost overnight. Prices stabilized, foreign investors flooded in, and Buenos Aires became the Paris of the South again. The country looked cured. But behind that stability was a paradox. Argentina had traded monetary freedom for borrowed credibility. Every dollar of stability had to be imported. Every policy decision now depended on the Federal Reserve's interest rates, not Argentina's own economy. When the United States raised rates in the late 1990s, capital fled emerging markets. The dollar grew stronger, and Argentina's dollarized peso became a trap. Exports collapsed. They were simply too expensive in global markets. The debt, however, remained in dollars. So the harder Argentina tried to defend its currency, the faster its reserves drained. Some economists called it a gold standard without the gold. Others, more sharply, a time bomb with perfect logic. Because mathematically, the system could not last. Meanwhile, international lenders, the IMF, Wall Street banks, European bondholders, praised Argentina's discipline. They lent more. They refinanced old debts with new ones. Every warning was smoothed over by another loan, another promise, another conference in New York. The illusion grew stronger precisely as the foundation weakened. And there was another, quieter dynamic at play, the political economy of pride. Abandoning the peg to the dollar would mean admitting defeat, that Argentina could not behave like a developed country. So the government chose to defend the illusion, no matter the cost. Inside the Ministry of Economy, spreadsheets told a cruel truth. By 2000, every 100 pesos of tax revenue had to cover 120 pesos of obligations. The difference came from foreign debt. And the more the peso stayed fixed, the faster the gap widened. This is the context of the default, a perfect storm not of emotion, but of arithmetic. A nation chained to a currency it didn't own, forced to burn through its reserves just to breathe another month. And yet, in that system's logic lies a pattern eerily familiar to our own. Because when local governments borrow in a unit of value they cannot issue, they enter the same silent contract Argentina signed 3 decades ago. The currency may differ, the language may change, but the mechanism, dependence on external liquidity, remains identical. History, it seems, does not punish mistakes. It repeats the mechanisms that created them. By mid-2001, Argentina was running on borrowed time and borrowed dollars. The reserves that guaranteed the one-to-one peg were almost gone. Every peso in circulation was still backed by a dollar, but only on paper. In practice, the vaults were empty. The numbers no longer matched the promises. That's when the mechanism began to turn against its creators. International creditors demanded proof of solvency. The IMF insisted on austerity: cut spending, raise taxes, freeze wages. The prescription was logical, but fatal. As the government tightened its belt, consumption collapsed, revenues fell, and the deficit widened even faster. The cure deepened the disease. And then came the bank runs. Ordinary Argentines, sensing the illusion was cracking, began withdrawing dollars from their accounts. Banks, unable to meet the demand, imposed restrictions. In December 2001, the government announced the corralito, a small fence around the nation's savings. People could withdraw only a few hundred pesos a week. Their money was there, but untouchable. That decision destroyed trust overnight. Within days, streets filled with protests. Pots and pans clanged outside shuttered banks, the sound of middle-class despair. The president fled the palace by helicopter. But beneath the chaos, a deeper truth emerged. The default wasn't a single act of defiance. It was the mathematical endpoint of a system that had run out of oxygen. Argentina had promised stability it couldn't fund. It had built a currency peg that turned into a vice. Foreign investors who once praised Argentina's discipline now rushed to court. They demanded repayment in full, not in devalued pesos, but in hard dollars. Some funds, later known as vulture funds, bought defaulted bonds for cents on the dollar and sued for the total value. And they won. Here lies the real problem. The mechanism of default had evolved. It was no longer just economic collapse. It became a legal machine for asset extraction. Through international courts, contracts, and arbitration, debt collection became globalized. The crisis didn't end with Argentina's declaration. It began a new phase, one where sovereignty was treated as collateral. And this is where the pattern turns chillingly modern, because the same structure, legal debt backed by fixed obligations, enforced by external contracts, is precisely how today's American municipal bond system functions. Cities, states, and pension funds live within a framework where default is not financial failure, but legal transgression. In 2001, Argentina's government tried to protect its citizens by freezing withdrawals. In 2026, a state may try to protect its retirees by freezing benefits. Different instrument, same logic. The problem was never Argentina alone. It was the discovery that even democratic systems can default, not with explosions, but with signatures. To understand how a nation collapses quietly, you have to trace the circuit of its promises. Money, debt, law. They form a closed system, a loop where each element depends on the other staying intact. In Argentina, that loop was built with mathematical precision and political blindness. The convertibility law of 1991 required that for every peso printed, the central bank held $1 in reserve. That was the anchor of trust. But here's the hidden clause. The reserves could include not just cash dollars, but also government bonds denominated in dollars. In other words, the state began backing its currency with its own IOUs. Debt became the collateral for money itself. Imagine a household paying its mortgage with another loan and using that new debt as proof of solvency. It worked as long as confidence held. When the flow of credit slowed, the mechanism inverted. Each dollar withdrawn pulled another peso out of circulation. Liquidity shrank. Banks faced insolvency. The IMF stepped in as lender of last resort, but with conditions. Each disbursement required cuts. Each cut deepened recession. Between 1998 and 2001, Argentina's GDP fell by more than 20%. Unemployment doubled. The more the country obeyed the fiscal rules, the faster the floor gave way. Here lies the mechanical paradox. Stability programs based on external currency discipline create the very instability they claim to prevent. The tighter the peg, the more fragile the system. Because when a country gives up its right to issue currency, it turns every financial shock into a liquidity crisis. Now, fast forward to the United States. Each state, by design, cannot print money. It must balance its budget or borrow through bond markets. Those bonds are bought by pension funds, insurers, and global investors. The guarantee is not gold or reserves, it's future tax revenue. Debt today, income tomorrow. And here's where the mechanism repeats. When the economy slows, revenues drop, but obligations remain fixed. Pensions, infrastructure bonds, healthcare costs. To cover the gap, states issue more bonds, often structured through complex derivatives that promise stability. Yet the collateral is always the same, tomorrow's taxpayer. This is the hidden symmetry between Buenos Aires in 2001 and Illinois in 2026. Both are locked in fiscal architectures that punish downturns. In both cases, the liquidity switch lies elsewhere, in a central authority that cannot or will not print on demand. When interest rates rise, when markets tighten, when investors demand higher yields, the loop begins to contract. First quietly, delayed payments, budget freezes, short-term borrowing. Then publicly, rating downgrades, emergency sessions, political paralysis. It's not ideology, it's engineering. A monetary system designed without a pressure valve will always break at the weakest joint. The tragedy is that it looks stable until the final hour. Debt, after all, feels like growth until the math stops balancing. When the mechanism broke, Argentina didn't simply default, it decomposed. The peso lost 2/3 of its value within months. Banks were nationalized overnight. Contracts were rewritten in devalued currency. The middle class, once the symbol of South American stability, fell into poverty almost instantly. But the collapse wasn't chaos, it was a sequence. Step 1, liquidity vanished. Step 2, assets were repriced. Step 3, ownership changed hands. Foreign corporations bought utilities, land, and infrastructure for a fraction of their former value. Multinationals with access to real dollars moved in while the local economy gasped for air. In that sense, the default was not just a failure, it was a transfer. Sovereignty became negotiable. And yet, life went on. Argentina didn't disappear. It adjusted. The peso floated, inflation returned, growth eventually resumed. But the structure of dependence on foreign credit, on legal arbitration in New York, on dollar-denominated contracts remained. The system had reset, not reformed. For citizens, the consequences lasted decades. Savings vanished, retirements dissolved. A generation learned to distrust banks. The word default became personal, not an event, but a memory of betrayal measured in lost homes and silent ATMs. Now, imagine that same mechanism inside a federal system like the United States. Each state, bound by debt covenants, pension obligations, and bond laws, faces obligations it cannot print its way out of. A sharp recession, a tightening credit market, or a federal impasse, and the arithmetic turns lethal. The state of Illinois, for instance, already spends nearly a quarter of its annual budget on pensions and debt service. New Jersey's unfunded liabilities exceed its GDP. California's municipal bonds, though rated safe, rely on future surpluses that exist only in optimistic models. The consequence is structural, not dramatic. Defaults here wouldn't look like riots, they'd look like cuts. School budgets trimmed, pensions frozen, infrastructure delayed. Each adjustment disguised as prudence, each sacrifice labeled fiscal responsibility. That's how systems collapse in advanced economies, not with panic, but with paperwork. Slow erosion instead of sudden implosion. The story of Argentina wasn't a warning for developing nations alone. It was a rehearsal for what happens when debt becomes governance itself. And if history rhymes again, it will be quieter and closer to home. The world of 2026 is not Buenos Aires in 2001. The skyscrapers are taller, the algorithms faster, the debt invisible. But the logic, the hidden architecture of obligation, is the same. Then it was called convertibility. Today, it's called market discipline. American states do not peg their currencies to the dollar. They are the dollar. Yet functionally, they live under the same constraint. They can spend, tax, and borrow, but they cannot create money. Only the Federal Reserve can. And the Fed, just like the IMF once was for Argentina, is a lender of last resort, but not for everyone. In 2020, during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve briefly opened the Municipal Liquidity Facility. It allowed states and cities to borrow directly when bond markets froze. It was a lifeline, but temporary. When it closed, the lesson was clear. Assistance exists only when crisis threatens the core, not the periphery. In normal times, each state stands alone. That structure creates a quiet hierarchy inside the union. Wealthy states with strong credit ratings access cheap money. Struggling states pay more, exactly as emerging markets once did. The same mechanism that separated Argentina from Germany now separates New Jersey from Texas. A rating agency replaces the IMF. A bond prospectus replaces a bailout agreement. And when interest rates rise, history folds in on itself. Debt service climbs, pension funds lose value, tax revenues stagnate. What follows is not explosion, but implosion. Internal cuts masked as discipline. Governors promise balanced budgets while postponing the future. It's the same choreography, performed on a different stage. Back then, the constraint was the dollar peg. Today, it's the bond market. In both cases, the currency of trust is external. Even the legal framework mirrors the past. Argentina's creditors sued in New York because contracts were written under U.S. law. Today, U.S. municipal bonds are structured under federal oversight, meaning any restructuring would pass through the same courts, the same legal codes, the same assumption. Contracts must be honored, even if citizens cannot afford them. And the most ironic echo? The vulture funds that once extracted billions from Argentina's default are now among the largest holders of U.S. state and municipal debt. The hunters of yesterday became the guarantors of today's stability, profiting from the very mechanisms they once helped break. It's a mirror with no distortion. Debt as an instrument of policy. Liquidity as a tool of control. Sovereignty traded for access to capital. Argentina's crisis wasn't Latin, it was modern. It revealed what happens when finance governs instead of supports, when money stops being a tool and becomes a law. The U.S. states are now learning that same lesson, quietly, ledger by ledger. Their balance sheets speak the same language Argentina once whispered before it defaulted. We owe more than we can pay, but less than we can admit. And when that sentence becomes national, when state liabilities meet federal hesitation, the mechanism will close its loop once again. History doesn't repeat, it upgrades its software. The story of Argentina's default was never about geography. It was about systems that forget their own limits. In 2001, it was the peso. In 2026, it is the state budget, the municipal bond, the pension ledger. Different names for the same illusion, that debt can replace growth, that credit can stand in for trust. When a government cannot issue its own liquidity, it becomes a hostage to the market. When the market becomes government, democracy turns into accounting. It happened once under the blue flag of the Southern Cone. Now it moves beneath the stars and stripes. The mechanism doesn't need coups or crises. It works in silence, through spreadsheets, interest rates, and clauses written in the fine print. Each cycle resets faith and then erodes it again. And perhaps that's the final paradox. We call it fiscal discipline, but it's closer to ritual, a recurring sacrifice to keep the numbers pure while the institutions decay underneath. Argentina showed the end of that ritual. America is rehearsing its beginning. History doesn't repeat, it waits. And when we stop listening, it simply changes the accent of its warning.